You probably picture the Middle Ages as a world of pious monks and buttoned-up villagers who barely knew how sex worked. Maybe you've even heard that absurd myth about couples fumbling through a hole in the bedsheet. Now imagine this instead. You walk into court and a panel of grim-faced judges orders you to strip down for a legally binding inspection. Official examiners prod and poke, checking whether your body is suitable for marriage. Fail the test, and your future collapses before the entire community. For medieval people, intimacy wasn't a private affair. It was a stage performance. Bishops built vast money-making empires out of regulating desire, and even wedding nights required witnesses who could later testify that the couple had done the deed. One humiliating verdict could ruin reputations, annul marriages, and strip families of inheritance rights. In a society obsessed with legacy, that wasn't just embarrassing, it was catastrophic. And here's the kicker. Compared to what's coming, that was mild. The deeper you look, the more disturbing it gets. Medieval sexuality was stranger, louder, and more invasive than anything modern life could throw at us. Even the trashiest dating show on television looks like quiet Sunday mass in comparison. Between 1100 and 1500, Europe saw practices so bizarre, so publicly grotesque, that no classroom dares to discuss them. This is the raw, unvarnished truth about how our ancestors turned the most private act into theatre for the crowd. We're about to descend through 7 layers of medieval madness. First, the nightmare of virility trials, where your performance wasn't behind closed doors but on record in court. Then, the horror of consummation ceremonies, where nobles literally stood guard as proof of your union. Next, the double lives of bishops who preached purity by day while running entertainment monopolies by night. You'll hear why medieval physicians prescribed satisfaction as medical treatment. We'll uncover deadly health rituals that risked killing the patient outright. You'll discover love potions brewed with revolting, even dangerous ingredients. And finally, the spectacle of adultery punishments, where the entire community gathered to jeer, shame, and degrade those who strayed. Each of these stories is more grotesque than the last, and by the end, you'll never take modern privacy for granted again. Let's start with what might be the most degrading courtroom ritual ever dreamt up by human cruelty, the so-called virility trials. These weren't whispered about in private chambers. They were staged spectacles where your most intimate capacities were dragged into the harsh glare of legal scrutiny. Picture France in the late 15th century. Inside a drafty stone hall, Jacques de la Palice trembles as he's ushered before solemn judges. Before him, a team of examiners stands ready to probe him in ways that today would be considered an assault rather than an inquiry. At the back, a court clerk scratches every shameful observation onto parchment. And here's the disturbing truth. This wasn't an outlandish one-off. It was standard procedure. Across Catholic Europe, husbands accused of impotence were summoned before tribunals. A single failure didn't just collapse a marriage, it could unravel entire estates, end dowry claims, and dismantle the fragile alliances families built their futures upon. Imagine a modern divorce hearing where, instead of lawyers trading barbs, the judge demands you strip down so a panel of surgeons and midwives can physically verify your capabilities. That was medieval justice, stripped of dignity and dripping with humiliation. These trials weren't conducted discreetly. Courthouses often had chambers specifically reserved for them, narrow rooms with barred windows, benches for gawking onlookers, and a raised platform where the accused stood half-clothed, awaiting judgment. The examiners arrived, draped in the symbols of their professions, their word treated as unimpeachable truth. Their process was coldly systematic. First, the man was presented before the entire chamber, then began the scrutiny. Surviving Florentine records describe examinations that dragged on for hours, with clerks noting everything from physical responses to the patient's ability to withstand shocks of heat or cold. The equipment? Primitive, intimidating, more dungeon than doctor's kit. Take Giovanni della Casa, an Italian clergyman writing in the 16th century. He catalogued case after case in which men were prodded, mocked, and measured like livestock. One poor Florentine merchant endured repeated examinations over weeks, each session crueler than the last, until the judges declared him incapable of marriage. His wife walked away with her inheritance intact. He was left branded as broken. Jacques de la Pallis's ordeal became infamous because of how far he went to avoid humiliation. On his third trial, he reportedly consumed concoctions of herbs so caustic they risked destroying his insides, just to scrape together enough strength to pass before the examiners. Poison, in that twisted system, felt like a safer gamble than public disgrace. That was the paradox at the heart of these ordeals. Men were technically allowed multiple trials, but with every failed attempt, their reputations bled out further. You weren't just failing in front of your spouse, you were collapsing under the gaze of judges, clerics, medical experts, and often the bride's entire family. The cruelty was meticulously documented, like a handbook in degradation. Imagine the horror, standing half-naked under flickering torchlight, strangers jotting down notes as your future disintegrates with every tremor. Some men fainted before the ordeal even began. Others sobbed as quills scratched their shame into permanence. And the punishment didn't end with the ruling. Each verdict traveled far beyond the courtroom. Tales of failure spilled into taverns, market stalls, and church pews, becoming gossip that could ruin a man's name for life. A single humiliating sentence followed him like a curse he could never outrun. What most people don't realize is that these humiliating trials weren't random acts of cruelty. They were built into the very foundation of medieval marriage. To understand why, you need to remember that in the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't primarily about love. It was about property, alliances, and bloodlines. A union wasn't considered valid until it had been physically consummated, and without children, the contract was seen as worthless. The Church hammered this idea relentlessly. According to its theology, the central purpose of marriage was reproduction. If a couple couldn't produce heirs, the marriage itself could be declared void. This belief was grounded in centuries of canon law, much of it inherited from Rome. Permanent incapacity wasn't just unfortunate, it was a legal basis for annulment. And medieval medicine, riddled with theories about bodily humors, treated intimate dysfunction as either a disease to be cured or a curse to be exorcised. Physicians prescribed remedies, priests offered spiritual interventions, and both claimed authority over the bedroom. Here's a detail most modern audiences find shocking. Women actually had legal rights to marital satisfaction. The Church explicitly taught that both husband and wife owed each other fulfillment when demanded. Failure to provide it wasn't framed as private disappointment. It was treated as a dereliction of duty. That's why a spouse's accusation carried enormous weight. Once a claim of incapacity was made, the accused stood before not only the court, but also society itself, branded as someone unfit to uphold their obligations. The records are staggering. In the great cities of Europe, London, Paris, Florence, over 200 of these trials occurred every decade. And if you were accused, the odds were grim. Fewer than a third of men ever succeeded in keeping their marriages intact. The fallout stretched far beyond the couple. Dowries were clawed back, family alliances collapsed, and entire business networks dissolved under the stain of annulment. A single failed trial could destabilize generations of planning. Compared to that, modern relationship counseling feels like paradise. Today, your most private struggles stay between you, your partner, and perhaps your doctor. No judges, no scribes. No courtroom demonstrations where your body is assessed like a defective machine. And the remedies we have now, medical treatments, therapies, discreet prescriptions, would have seemed like witchcraft to those trapped in medieval courts. The idea of privacy in such matters is, historically speaking, a very recent luxury. But here's where the story turns from invasive to unthinkable. Fitness trials, at least, came after the vows were spoken. Now, imagine if your wedding night itself was a public ritual, one that required witnesses to confirm you had completed the act. If you thought trials were humiliating, wait until you hear about the ceremonial verifications, where consummation wasn't private bliss, but a performance staged for an audience of nobles. In 1464, 12-year-old Joan of France was handed over in marriage to Louis, Duke of Orleans. Later Louis XII of France. She was barely more than a child. That night, courtiers, priests, and bishops crowded into the chamber, pressing in close around the curtained bed. They weren't waiting politely in some antechamber. They stood inside, ears straining for movement, breaths held for sounds that might prove the union was sealed. Without that proof, The marriage would not legally stand. At the foot of the bed stood senior clerics, murmuring blessings while the terrified couple attempted what was expected of them. This wasn't a private act of love, it was a public performance on which dynasties depended. Now imagine it, your family, your priest, and your sovereign watching, or listening, while you fumble through the most intimate act of your life. That was the cruel theatre of royal weddings in late medieval Europe, and the humiliation began long before the sheets were drawn. First came the ritual stripping. Joan was undressed by her female relatives, who mocked her youth and fragility even as they spoke of her duty to breed heirs. The groom was undressed by his male kin, who threw out lewd jokes as though preparing him for a tournament, not a wedding. Every layer of clothing was peeled away to the jeers of the crowd. Then came the forced march. The couple was paraded down candlelit corridors lined with guests who hurled grain, nuts, and fruit, claiming it was for fertility, while clearly reveling in the degradation. Along the way, they were made to gulp down wine mixed with bitter aphrodisiac herbs and to choke on sticky honeyed cakes, all while drunks shouted advice about what to do once the curtains closed. Inside the chamber, priests sprinkled holy water over the sheets like they were blessing an altar. Fertility prayers were recited, not whispered, but chanted loudly enough for all to hear. Curtains were drawn, yet never fully. Witnesses stationed themselves within the room, some standing only steps from the bed, others by the doors to ensure no one slipped away. Every groan, every shift of fabric, was seized upon as proof. The most chilling accounts come from French marriage contracts, like those of Anne of Brittany. Her unions demanded visible consummation under oath, with multiple nobles required to swear they had observed or at least overheard enough to declare the marriage valid. The act itself became less about two lives joining, and more about furnishing legal evidence for political treaties. Charles VIII of France endured such pressure on his own wedding night. Chroniclers describe nobles crowding around as if the fate of the kingdom hinged on a boy barely prepared for adulthood, proving himself under their gaze. The tension was so suffocating that even the most powerful heir in Europe could feel like a cornered animal, stripped of dignity before the court. In Spain, the legitimacy of Juana la Beltraneja became a dynastic crisis precisely because of questions of consummation. Gossip whispered through the courts that her parents' marriage bed had been compromised, that she was not the true child of the king. A single moment of intimacy, or the failure of it, was enough to send kingdoms spiraling towards civil war. These marriages were never just personal. They were political contracts where the bodies of young brides and grooms became the battlegrounds of nations. Failure to perform wasn't a private embarrassment. It could break alliances, topple treaties, or ignite war. And the humiliation didn't end when the torches went out. By morning, the sheets were paraded through castle corridors or hung for the public to see. Midwives were summoned to examine the bride and swear oaths about what they found. Witnesses submitted written depositions detailing noises, movements, or even the rhythm of the bed. Some were ordered to remain for multiple nights, ensuring repeated attempts if the first was judged insufficient. To fail was ruinous. If consummation was left unproven, annulment followed swiftly, dowries were clawed back, and entire political strategies collapsed. For the young couples trapped in these arrangements, the pressure was merciless. Teenagers asked to carry the weight of empires in the most humiliating way imaginable. And yet, shocking as this ritual was, it was only one side of the hypocrisy. Because even as kings and clerics staged these degrading spectacles in the name of morality, many of those same men were quietly exploiting desire for profit, building underground empires of entertainment, while preaching chastity in public. What most people don't grasp is why this grotesque spectacle was taken so seriously. Royal marriages weren't just about romance, they were the glue holding medieval Europe together. A single union could prevent wars, secure trade routes, or guarantee a dynasty's survival. But without consummation, none of it mattered. An unsealed marriage was legally nothing. Inheritance law demanded airtight proof that unions were real. The virginity of noble brides was treated as a transferable asset, something families displayed, measured, and ceremonially handed over like a title deed. And the church? It doubled down. Marriage was proclaimed a holy sacrament, but doctrine insisted that the sacrament wasn't complete until flesh met flesh. Priests preached the theology bluntly. They believed true unity of marriage was only achieved through actual physical consummation. Witnesses weren't optional. They were considered safeguards, living guarantees against scandal or dispute. If a king needed heirs beyond question, if a noble house was surrendering a dowry worth a fortune, then society demanded verification. In their eyes, the stability of kingdoms rested on what happened in the bedchamber. The pressure was enormous because all of society was watching. Communities invested in noble fertility the way modern investors watch markets. A confirmed heir meant security. An unproven union meant chaos, succession wars, blood feuds, entire regions destabilized. And so the practice flourished. The French staged lavish ceremonies with dozens of spectators. The English often focused on the mourning evidence, displaying sheets for public approval. Italians sometimes went further, crowding the entire wedding party into the chamber as though it were theatre. By comparison, the worst we endure today at a wedding is a drunk uncle's speech or an embarrassing dance. Modern audiences would be horrified by how deeply medieval communities entangled themselves in their rulers' intimacy. We live in a world where privacy is assumed to be a basic right, but that's a modern invention. Before the 18th century, intimacy was rarely private. It was community business, with legal, political, and financial weight behind it. And here's the dark irony. While the church demanded this surveillance in the name of purity, its own bishops were secretly running vast entertainment industries built on the very desires they condemned. Nowhere did medieval hypocrisy fester more grotesquely than inside the church itself. The very men who thundered from pulpits about purity and sin were quietly running commercial empires that would make a Wall Street banker blush. In the 14th century, the Bishop of Augsburg presided over a network of licensed brothels so vast it rivaled the city's guilds. These weren't shadowy dens hidden in alleys. They operated openly, with painted signs, posted price lists, and the bishop's own insignia displayed like a seal of quality. Women forced into this system were mocked as Augsburg doves, their lives reduced to profit margins written into the bishop's ledgers. And the profits? They poured directly into the bishop's coffers. They funded clerical salaries, paid for church schools, and most damningly, bankrolled the expansion of Augsburg Cathedral. Every hymn echoing beneath that vaulted roof was, in reality, paid for by the very trade the bishop denounced on Sundays. These operations weren't amateur. Brothels under episcopal control were purpose-built in districts governed by church courts, complete with guards who doubled as tax collectors. Some catered to rowdy crowds with music and drink. Others served the wealthy elite, where women certified healthy by church physicians charged double. Surviving registers reveal earnings equivalent to hundreds of thousands in modern money, accounted for with chilling precision. The Archbishop of Cologne affected the bureaucracy of desire. Women in his jurisdiction were forced to purchase annual licenses, taxed weekly for the privilege of working, and fined heavily if they dared to stop during holy festivals. During Lent, activity was supposedly banned, yet, for a higher fee, business carried on behind locked doors. The hypocrisy was ritualized into law. Recruitment was no less disturbing. Each year, local fairs became hunting grounds, where impoverished girls seeking housework were instead siphoned into brothels. Officials examined them like livestock, inspecting teeth, skin, and strength, before sending them to whichever establishment promised the biggest returns. What was preached as salvation for the soul became a market for the body. The Bishop of Constance offers one of the starkest examples. His diocese not only sanctioned brothels but became infamous at the Council of Constance in 1414, where church leaders met to reform corruption. They did so accompanied by an estimated 700 women from the very trade they publicly condemned. The irony was so grotesque it bordered on parody, bishops debating morality while literally lodged above their own brothels. And this wasn't just a German scandal. Across Europe, wherever the church held authority, it learned how to tax and monetize desire. Archbishops skimmed 30 to 40% of revenues, priests conducted health checks, and guards patrolled the streets under the guise of protection. Some establishments even promised pensions for women who survived long enough to retire, but few lived to see them. In Spain, the hypocrisy reached fever pitch. In Seville, brothels were physically attached to the cathedral complex, connected by tunnels so priests could pass unseen from cloister to bedchamber. Women were required to attend mass each morning, sitting in pews reserved for them. listening to the same men who would hire them later thunder against lust. The scale, the shamelessness, the sheer contradiction, all of it dwarfs most modern scandals. And yet, for medieval people, this wasn't even the strangest collision of morality and intimacy, because when bishops weren't profiting from desire, physicians were prescribing it, turning sexuality itself into a medical treatment. To grasp how bishops justified this breathtaking hypocrisy, you have to dive into the twisted moral calculus of medieval Christianity. Church fathers like Augustine described vice in almost bureaucratic terms. It was a necessary sewer, disgusting but required to keep the rest of the city clean. Thomas Aquinas went further, arguing that brothels were society's safety valves, preventing worse sins like assault or adultery. In their logic, regulating vice wasn't corruption, it was public service. Of course, the real motive was simpler: money. Cathedrals cost fortunes, bishops lived like minor kings, wars drained treasuries, and unlike unpredictable tithes, entertainment taxes flowed in week after week, a dependable stream of silver. Historians estimate that in some cities, as much as 30% of church income came from this trade alone. The Bishop of Winchester's empire could fund the construction of a brand new church every year. The profit margins were obscene. A standard fee might be 4 pence. The woman kept 1. Another penny covered operating expenses. The other 2 went directly to the bishop's coffers. Multiply that by thousands of transactions every week across hundreds of licensed establishments, and you see why reform never stood a chance. The medieval church wasn't just complicit, it was addicted. And here's the most surprising part. This wasn't even shocking to contemporaries. People didn't expect their bishops to be spiritual only. They were land barons, tax administrators, and businessmen. Running entertainment districts was simply another branch of the portfolio, no different from mills, toll bridges, or vineyards. A bishop could thunder against lust in a Sunday sermon, then calmly sit down on Monday to review weekly profit reports from the same vice he condemned. No contradiction was felt because none was admitted. Control was part of the attraction. By licensing, taxing, and regulating the trade, the church controlled not only revenue, but people. It dictated who could sell services, where, and at what price. It marked women with specific dress codes, branding them as socially other. It divided desire into neat categories: legitimate, illegitimate, taxable, forbidden. Far from a scandal, this system was considered good governance. Compared to this, today's church scandals seem almost innocent. Modern leaders try to conceal their indiscretions. Medieval bishops carved their coats of arms above brothel doors. They didn't hide their hypocrisy, they institutionalized it. And yet the contradictions went deeper still. Because the same church that raked in profits from vice also preached that intimacy was a sacred duty. Doctors and priests alike insisted that in the right context, satisfaction wasn't sin at all. It was medicine. The church's contradictions didn't end with bishops running brothels. They went even deeper, straight into the medical textbooks, because in the Middle Ages, doctors literally prescribed pleasure as medicine. Medieval medical theory insisted that a woman could not conceive at all unless she reached climax. That wasn't seen as speculation. It was accepted fact, taught at Europe's most prestigious universities, and copied into every serious medical manual. The logic came from the so-called two-seed theory. Conception required a contribution from both sexes, and a woman could only release hers during peak experience. If she failed to reach it, conception was thought to be impossible. The consequences were bizarre. Husbands weren't simply encouraged to be attentive. They were medically obligated to learn technique. Physicians taught methods in lectures. Midwives gave private instruction. Intimacy was prescribed with the same gravity we treat antibiotics today. The theory traced back to Galen, the ancient Greek physician whose writings dominated medieval thought. Galen insisted women possessed their own reproductive seed, housed in hidden organs, and, just like men, it only emerged through climax. Medieval doctors took his ideas and ran wild, designing elaborate classifications of female response. They catalogued women as hot or cold, moist or dry. Each constitution supposedly required its own approach. Cold women needed positions that generated friction. Overly moist women were prescribed alternatives to dry them out. The complexity rivaled modern sex manuals, except it was built on completely flawed anatomy. And yet the detail is staggering. Medical texts like the Trotula offered precise guidance. Rub the body with perfumed oils, focus on sensitive parts, use rhythm and gentleness. They even recommended specific positions. Woman on top for cold temperaments, side by side for tilted wombs, and inventive alternatives for women with excessive humidity. Doctors went further, inventing tools and treatments that sound like parodies of modern intimacy aids. They prescribed carved wooden devices warmed by fire, oils infused with cinnamon or pepper to heighten sensitivity, and herbal poultices applied directly before intimacy. Some even believed music could spark desire, recommending rhythmic drumming or lute songs to stimulate arousal. This created a strange medical specialty. Midwives became de facto intimacy coaches. They trained couples with diagrams, cloth models, and sometimes direct supervision, coaching rhythm, technique, and even timing. Instruction manuals depicted positions with startling frankness, making them closer to sex guides than medical treatises. Meanwhile, a lucrative market in fertility enhancers emerged. Wealthy women bought concoctions of pearls ground into wine, tinctures of mandrake root, or jade implements said to strengthen the womb. Some devices were studded with jewels, others filled with herbal infusions meant to heat the body. The wealthier the woman, the more exotic and dangerous the remedies. Case notes survive that read like bizarre medical drama. One merchant's wife, childless after 3 years, was prescribed daily massages with heated oils, diets of ginger and cinnamon, and special instruction for her husband. Within 2 months she conceived, and the success was credited entirely to her newly achieved delight. The diagnostic tools were equally surreal. Physicians developed primitive sensitivity tests with feathers, heated rods, and even hollow tubes designed to amplify sounds of arousal. For them, female response wasn't mystery. It was measurable data, proof of fertility. And the church's stance on this? A theological tightrope. Pleasure for its own sake was a sin, but pleasure in the service of conception was a sacred duty. A woman who enjoyed intimacy too much risked being called sinful. A woman who failed to enjoy it enough risked being blamed for infertility. Medieval medicine had turned female pleasure into a science of contradictions, half clinical, half superstition, and always hovering between salvation and sin. But not every prescription was harmless, because when medieval doctors reached for cures, some of the treatments they prescribed were so hazardous they often killed faster than the conditions they were meant to treat. Priests argued furiously over a question so absurd it bordered on cruel. If a woman felt pleasure during conception, was her child born stained with lust? Some clerics insisted that female satisfaction tainted the womb, producing offspring destined for sin. Others twisted it further, claiming that a cold, joyless conception birthed children broken from the start, souls warped before they even opened their eyes. For women, this was a trap with no exit. Confession manuals laid out impossible rules. To enjoy intimacy was sinful, but to admit indifference was also a moral failing. A woman could be damned either way, judged for how her own body betrayed her. Priests were even instructed to interrogate women in detail. Did they properly respond to their husband's advances? Did they reach the necessary release for conception to occur? Imagine the humiliation of confessing to a holy man whether you had climaxed, knowing his judgment would decide if your marriage, your body, your very soul was considered pure. And worse still, if a woman admitted she faked satisfaction just to make an unwanted encounter end sooner, priests warned she was sabotaging God's design for childbirth, turning her attempt at survival into a mortal sin. This web of contradictions spawned a hidden network of forbidden knowledge. Midwives quietly taught the very practices priests thundered against from pulpits. Convents became havens of secret medical study, where nuns circulated texts on fertility and passed down intimate remedies. What was heresy in church became healthcare in the cloister. Among women themselves, fertility tricks were whispered, often nothing more than coded instructions for achieving pleasure disguised as medical advice. Satisfaction was condemned as vice, yet demanded by physicians as a requirement for healthy conception. Here's what almost no one realizes. Medieval medicine wasn't detached fantasy. It drew from centuries of trial and error. Observations filtered through flawed theories, yes, but observations nonetheless. Practitioners saw the link between female satisfaction and fertility. They simply explained it with humors instead of hormones. The pressure was economic as much as moral. Noble dynasties required heirs to secure bloodlines. Merchants needed successors to guard fortunes. Farmers depended on children for survival. A barren household could mean financial collapse. So, despite the church's fire and brimstone warnings, medicine declared female satisfaction essential. Gender lines shaped this contradiction. Learned male doctors filled manuscripts with theory, while women midwives carried the raw, practical expertise. These women disguised intimate knowledge under the veil of treatments and warming tonics. Teaching satisfaction was sin. Prescribing herbs to aid conception was science. The irony is brutal. By medieval standards, physicians were more progressive than many later doctors. Victorians pretended women felt nothing. Early 20th century medicine branded female desire a sickness. But in the Middle Ages, however misguided, physicians acknowledged women's intimate responses as real, vital, and medically necessary. For medieval women, the impact was staggering. Unlike in later centuries, they could invoke medical authority to demand their own satisfaction. In some annulment cases, women argued that a husband's failure to provide pleasure was grounds to end the marriage. Medical texts warned men that neglecting their wives' desire was dereliction of duty. The so-called two-seed theory may have been scientifically wrong, but it carved out a rare space for women to assert agency over their bodies. And if that seems astonishing, brace yourself. Because when it came to avoiding pregnancy, medieval women turned to methods so extreme, so bizarre, they make modern birth control look tame. If medieval doctors prescribing female satisfaction sounds strangely forward-thinking, their contraception practices were a plunge straight into nightmare. Women risked their lives with every attempt to block conception, and the ingredient list reads more like the contents of a poisoner's workshop than a medical prescription. Heavy metals, rotting animal parts, caustic plants, and outright filth. These weren't whispered superstitions from backwoods villages. They were recorded, endorsed and circulated by physicians trained in Europe's most prestigious universities. That meant the methods had the authority of science, even when they were essentially self-administered torture. Women shoved toxic pessaries inside their bodies before intercourse, drank metallic brews that rotted their insides, and risked permanent mutilation just to avoid yet another dangerous pregnancy. The choice was grotesque but real. Swallow mercury and gamble with madness, or face childbirth again, a process that killed 1 in 3 women. For many, poison seemed like the lesser of two evils. Some of the barrier methods at least showed ingenuity, though most carried hidden horrors. Crocodile dung, for example, wasn't random filth. Its alkaline properties could disrupt sperm, which is why Egyptian physicians recommended it millennia earlier. But in Europe, where crocodiles were a fantasy animal, women made do with horse, cow, or pig dung. Instead of preventing pregnancy, they often ended up with raging infections that rotted them from within. Others turned to honey mixed with plant gums. Acacia ferments into acid, which actually helped, and honey's antibacterial qualities gave the mixture some protection. Wool or lint soaked in this sticky paste became early sponges. But the danger wasn't conception, it was infection. If the material got stuck, women could develop sepsis and die within days. Medical texts grimly record such cases. Sea sponges soaked in vinegar or wine were a step up, acting as both barrier and chemical defense. In the Mediterranean, natural sponges were accessible. In Northern Europe, desperate women substituted moss, rags, or even bread. Yes, bread. Unsurprisingly, the risk of infection remained constant, and timing the removal was a deadly gamble. Then there were animal membrane sheaths, the primitive ancestors of condoms, crafted from pig bladders, sheep intestines, or fish skins. They were luxuries for the wealthy. Tied on with ribbons, softened in milk before use. They were reusable but fragile. The church branded them armor against God, and anyone caught risked excommunication. Imagine choosing between eternal damnation or a pig bladder tied to your husband. The chemical methods were even worse. Mercury-based potions promised to cool the womb, but left women trembling, toothless, and insane. Physicians knew mercury was toxic but prescribed it anyway, because infertility was considered a fate worse than death. Lead-based remedies, nicknamed sweet salt, poisoned women from the inside out. Skeletons unearthed in medieval graveyards still hold lethal traces of lead, grim evidence of contraception that killed its user before her 20s. Copper solutions, adopted from Arabic medicine, caused chemical burns so severe they scarred women for life. Yet physicians insisted the searing pain was proof the treatment worked. Herbal brews like pennyroyal, rue, and tansy were safer, but still treacherous. The dosage line between preventing pregnancy and destroying your liver was razor thin. Women memorized chants of seeds and sips like survival codes, each recipe a potential death sentence. The magical methods veered into the grotesque. Amulets made from weasel genitals, mule's ear wax, and even severed hands of dead infants were worn during intercourse. Witch trial documents describe a black market in infant corpses, traded specifically for contraceptive charms. Mule wax was prized because mules were sterile, sympathetic magic at its bleakest. The sheer horror of this trade reveals the desperation women felt when trapped between hunger and childbirth. Menstrual blood became both ritual and remedy. Some women powdered it and slipped it into their husband's wine to weaken his virility. Others burned their rags and inserted the ashes as pessaries. And still others believed that sex during menstruation itself was contraceptive, a practice denounced by the church as doubly sinful. The most dangerous recipes involved black cats. Their organs, harvested at precise astrological moments, were dried and inserted into the body as supposed pregnancy blockers. But cats were symbols of witchcraft, and possessing such material was practically an invitation to be accused of sorcery. Excavations from medieval cesspits have uncovered piles of cat bones near convents, proof that even holy women trafficked in this forbidden knowledge. Why did women endure such torment? Because repeated childbirth shattered their bodies. The average medieval woman who survived to old age endured 8 to 12 pregnancies. Many didn't survive at all. Childbirth was the #1 killer of young women. Poor families starved when forced to feed another mouth. Husbands, legally entitled to access, refused to withdraw. And the church thundered against every attempt at prevention. So women built secret networks. Midwives became smugglers of contraceptive herbs, distributing recipes coded in whispers. Prostitutes passed down professional tricks. Even nuns studied fertility texts to treat desperate women at the convent gates. For this, they were later branded witches, not for casting spells, but for knowing how to stop life. Every act of contraception was a game of Russian roulette, a gamble where the bullet was poison, infection, or accusation. Yet women still risked it, because the alternative was worse. Modern birth control, safe and legal, feels like a miracle only because the past was so unthinkably grim. And if you think these methods were extreme, just wait until you hear what women willingly consumed in the name of love potions, recipes that make contraception look merciful by comparison. Forget roses and candlelight. Medieval love rituals called for ingredients torn from the dead, hidden collections of bodily fluids, and even bone marrow taken from the bodies of children. It was less chocolate and champagne, and more necromancy with a side of cannibalism. Take Beatrice d'Anasol, put on trial in France in 1320. Her crime? Feeding her lover wine laced with her own menstrual blood. She wasn't deranged. She was following recipes preserved in grimoires, manuals of magic that circulated among women desperate to bind men to them. These weren't abstract spells. They were detailed instructions calling for powdered infant bones, organs of the freshly hanged, dove brains, human hearts ground to dust. Women raided cemeteries, bribed executioners for body parts, and harvested their own fluids as if stocking a laboratory. Grave robbing wasn't a crime of greed, it was a ritual of love. Child bone marrow was thought to carry the strongest power, especially from the unbaptized. Gravediggers were bribed to unearth tiny coffins, or women crept into churchyards under moonlight to do it themselves. Within 3 days, marrow was extracted with heated needles, dried, ground, and mixed with wine and honey. The concoction would then be slipped into a man's cup, dose by dose, until he was hopelessly bound. Menstrual blood was collected with care, stored in ceramic pots carved with symbols, sometimes dried into cakes, sometimes mixed fresh into food. Some recipes demanded blood from precise cycle days, others required lunar timing. The most extreme potions combined menstrual blood with fluids from intimacy, brewing together the essence of both lovers in an alchemy of obsession. Hair played its part too. Snipped secretly during sex or saved from sheets, strands were burned with incense, powdered into charms, or braided with the woman's own and worn against the skin. If taken without the man's knowledge, the spell was believed twice as powerful, making intimacy itself a hunting ground for magic. Corpse organs required violent deaths. Executed criminals were prime sources, suicides second best. Hearts, livers, and lungs were dried, spiced with mandrake and vervain, and ground into powders. Executioners, already feared figures, built lucrative side businesses selling bloody leftovers to women who couldn't risk digging graves themselves. The rituals matched the grotesque ingredients. Midnight graveyard trips were timed to moon phases. Some required women to strip naked. Others demanded they wear their lovers' clothes while reciting broken scraps of Latin. Mixing often had to be done at crossroads, churchyards, or on the bare earth under a full moon. The smallest mistake, wrong moon, wrong chant, was said to turn love into madness. Grimoires gave dosing charts with chilling precision. Too little potion, and the man stayed indifferent. Too much, and he went insane, sometimes dead within weeks. Women tracked results like alchemists, refining doses, noting symptoms, trading recipes. Some became renowned love witches, selling services to others for a fee. The risks were staggering. The church condemned love magic as sorcery. Secular courts called it poisoning. Penalties ranged from exile to execution, depending on class and outcome. A noblewoman might be scolded into a convent. A peasant could be burned alive. In Augsburg, offenders were forced to drink their own potions in front of the crowd, a punishment that often ended in violent death. And yet, the potions sometimes seemed to work. Men testified in court that they felt bewitched, hearts racing, minds clouded, aroused against their will. Was it poison? Suggestion? The terror of believing yourself cursed? Perhaps all three. The result was undeniable. Women believed these potions could change their lives, and men often believed it too. The desperation behind this gruesome trade was economic as much as romantic. For most women, marriage wasn't about love, it was survival. An unmarried woman past her youth faced poverty and shame. A widow without prospects risked starvation. Landing a wealthy husband could rescue not just her, but her entire family. In that light, desecrating graves for potion ingredients wasn't insanity. It was strategy. Marriage to a merchant or a minor noble meant food, shelter, and a secure future. The difference between a craftsman and a laborer was the difference between comfort and hunger. In a world where a woman's fate hinged on the man she bound to her, love potions weren't a game. They were investments. Investments bought with blood, bones, and the dead. And if this sounds horrific already, the next chapter reveals something darker still. When love magic failed, some women turned not to binding spells but to rituals of vengeance. Hexes designed not to capture men, but to destroy them. Medieval love magic didn't spring from nowhere. It carried the fingerprints of the ancient world. Poets like Ovid, in his Art of Love, casually described potions and charms, while Greek magical papyri laid out full-blown recipes for binding spells. Medieval grimoires copied these word for word, adapting them to Christian Europe. That classical heritage gave the whole enterprise a strange legitimacy. After all, if Rome's most celebrated poet wrote about it, could it really be diabolical? The overlap between medicine and magic blurred the boundaries further. Ingredients now thought grotesque often began as legitimate remedies. Dove's blood, for example, was prescribed against seizures. Human marrow appeared in treatments for aching joints. Apothecaries sold brains, organs, and bone as medicine. What women did with them afterward was their secret. A physician might think he was treating a headache, while unknowingly supplying the makings of a love spell. But the gender politics of these practices were unmistakable. Men and women both turned to love magic, yet the legal hammer almost always fell on women. Male practitioners were called magicians or scholars, cloaked in intellectual authority. Women, even when using identical rituals, were labeled witches. A man weaving enchantments was seen as clever. A woman doing the same was seen as dangerous, overturning the natural order by bending male will to hers. Even the church's stance was riddled with contradictions. Officially, all magic was condemned as heresy. Yet in practice, clergy blurred the line between prayer and spell. Priests blessed candles to help women win affection, sold sanctified water for use in rituals, and some monasteries quietly built reputations as places to procure charms of the heart. What they denounced from the pulpit, they supplied from the vestry. The real concern wasn't the act itself, but the suspicion of demonic influence behind it. By comparison, swiping right on a dating app seems like a miracle of simplicity. Modern romance may be messy, full of ghosting and bad first dates, but at least it doesn't require grave robbing or bloodletting. The dark arts of love have been replaced with profile pictures, emojis, and algorithmic matchmaking. The risks today are bruised egos, not actual poisonings. And yet, the extremity of medieval women's measures tells us something profound. Beneath all the blood and bone dust was the same human longing that drives romance now. The need to be wanted, to be chosen, to escape loneliness. Love magic was desperation weaponized, a survival strategy in a world where marriage could decide whether a woman thrived or starved. But while potions and charms were hidden acts, the most brutal punishments weren't reserved for secret love magic at all. They were inflicted publicly on those caught in adultery. Think being cancelled online is humiliating? In the Middle Ages, adultery wasn't punished with whispers or angry posts. It was punished with a naked parade, a rope tied around the man's waist, and the woman forced to drag him through town like livestock. In parts of southern France, the punishment was known as la course, the run. Adulterous couples weren't merely reprimanded. They were thrust into a choreographed spectacle of humiliation, a ritual meant to shatter both body and reputation in full view of the town. Forget hashtags, medieval cancel culture came with whips, chamber pots, and the certainty of blood. At dawn, church bells summoned the town. This wasn't an impromptu mob, it was a sanctioned civic ritual. Town criers announced the names of the guilty, often with salacious details of how they'd been discovered. The accused were stripped in the square while officials supervised, ensuring no detail of their degradation was missed. Then came the rope. Tied tight around the man's waist, the other end was placed in the woman's hands. Together, they were forced to run a set route through town. Crowds lined the streets, armed with rotten vegetables, willow branches, and buckets of human waste saved for the occasion. The punishment wasn't just about shame. It was about turning the body itself into a message. The route was carefully planned, leading them past the church, through the busy marketplace, around the town well, and by the taverns packed with drinkers. At each stop, the crowd had their turn to inflict pain. Merchants shut shops, laborers abandoned fields, parents brought children to watch. This was moral theatre, discipline staged as spectacle. The whole town prepared days in advance. Rotten produce was stockpiled, waste collected, special whips braided. Vendors even sold refreshments to spectators, as if adultery punishment were a festival. Musicians sometimes beat drums in rhythm with the run. Bells rang in patterns, fast when the humiliation began, slow at punishment stations, triumphant when the ordeal ended. Some parishes even had dedicated adultery bells, used only for this ritual. Carcassonne's 1,347 records describe a merchant's wife who pulled her young lover 3 miles while townsfolk thrashed them both with willow branches. She barely survived and fled town immediately. He died within a week. The rope had cut so deep into his waist that infection killed him. Toulouse's records from 1,389 show a knight humiliated in the same way, led by a baker's wife. His noble birth didn't spare him. If anything, the crowd relished the reversal of hierarchy. The beatings left him crippled, unable to ride again. His military career ended not on the battlefield but in the gutter of his own town. Survival was never guaranteed. Court records suggest as many as 4 in 10 men didn't live long after the punishment, their bodies rotted by infections from the rope and the blows. Women had slightly better odds but often suffered permanent scarring. For some, the prospect of la course was so unbearable they fled into exile or chose suicide over the public degradation. Adultery in the medieval world wasn't just a private betrayal, It was a crime against the community, and the punishment turned the sinner's body into a living warning. And yet, as brutal as this was, Europe's treatment of women accused of witchcraft would soon eclipse even this ritual of shame. La Course wasn't just punishment, it was theatre, and the crowd itself was part of the performance. The most savage blows almost always came from those closest to the wronged spouse. Family members were expected to attack, proving loyalty through violence, but it didn't stop there. Anyone with a buried grudge could seize the moment. A rejected suitor, a business rival, even a neighbor angry over a fence dispute, all could step forward and lash the condemned under the guise of defending morality. The ritual doubled as a pressure valve. Old resentments, simmering rivalries, debts unpaid, all could be discharged in the sanctioned violence of adultery punishment. What looked like moral discipline was also collective revenge. Behind it lay a worldview that saw sin not as private guilt but as contamination. Adultery wasn't just a betrayal of a spouse, it tainted the whole community. It endangered inheritance, cast doubt on paternity, destabilized family alliances, and threatened the fragile balance of the economy. To restore order, the stain had to be purged physically, publicly, and violently. Every whip, every strike, every rotten apple hurled was imagined as a blow against chaos itself. The gender symbolism was clear and cruel. By forcing the woman to hold the rope, the ritual presented her as the unnatural aggressor, a temptress dragging men down with her lust. The man, stripped and led like livestock, embodied male weakness, proof that desire could reduce him to the level of an animal. Yet when the running stopped, the double standard resumed. Many women were cast out of town entirely, their reputations beyond repair, while men who survived sometimes returned to their homes and businesses, chastened but not exiled. The economic logic behind this brutality was simple. Adultery was theft of lineage, property, and stability. In a society where bloodlines determined inheritance and marriages cemented business ties, an affair wasn't just lust, it was sabotage. Public punishment wasn't only retribution, it was reassurance. By parading adulterers through town, the community reasserted the sanctity of its contracts and the clarity of its bloodlines. Different regions expressed this with different rituals. In England, adulterers were more often locked in pillories or stocks, mocked rather than paraded. German towns shaved heads or smeared tar, branding shame into the skin, but in southern France and Italy, the rope ritual dominated. Some historians trace this fixation back to Roman law, where public humiliation was considered the ultimate corrective. Whether it worked as deterrence is doubtful. Court records suggest adultery rates barely budged, despite the lashings and deaths. But deterrence may never have been the true goal. The real purpose was bonding, uniting communities through shared violence, reminding everyone of the marriage code, and offering a spectacle that blended punishment with entertainment. By the 16th century, towns began softening the practice. The rope binding disappeared first, after too many deaths drew legal complications. Symbolic processions replaced violent runs. Couples paraded backwards on donkeys, or forced to wear placards declaring their sin. Humiliation persisted, but the bloodshed lessened. Today, the whips are gone, but the instinct remains. Twitter mobs may not tie ropes, but they still bind reputations, drag offenders through the digital square, and bombard them with verbal blows. The tools have changed. Hashtags instead of willow switches, angry posts instead of chamber pots, but the hunger for public shaming and the scars it leaves are hauntingly familiar. And just as adultery tore at the fabric of community, accusations of witchcraft would soon give Europe an even more violent stage for collective punishment, one where humiliation gave way to fire. After trudging through fitness trials where men had to prove themselves in court, through wedding chambers where nobles leered at newlyweds in bed, through bishops cashing profits from sin while preaching purity, through doctors prescribing satisfaction while priests damned it, through women poisoning themselves with mercury and dung in the name of contraception, through grave-robbing love potions brewed with infant bones, and through rope-leash adultery parades that left people dead in the street, one truth stands unshakable. We've just explored 7 rings of medieval madness that make modern society look tame by comparison. Judges measured men's capabilities, while scribes dutifully recorded. Royal families invaded bedrooms to verify consummation. Bishops preached chastity while pocketing profits from the very pleasures they condemned. Physicians demanded women climax for conception, even as priests branded it sinful. Women gambled their lives on poisons masquerading as medicine. Lovers dug up children's bones to bind affection. And adulterers were literally dragged naked through town like beasts, pelted until their bodies broke. The revelation is not repression, but exposure. Medieval intimacy wasn't hidden behind curtains of shame. It was public property. Your body was evidence. Your bedroom was a courtroom. Your desires were weighed by priests, physicians, and neighbors alike. Privacy, as we understand it, did not exist. To a medieval mind, the idea that what happens in the bedroom stays in the bedroom would have sounded like blasphemy. Why? Because sex meant everything. Economically, it determined inheritance. Politically, it secured dynasties. Socially, adultery was contamination. Medically, pleasure was a requirement. Religiously, every act echoed into eternity. With so much at stake, of course intimacy couldn't be private. Of course it had to be policed. The shift from public intimacy to private sexuality is one of history's most radical transformations. Courtroom inspections gave way to doctor-patient confidentiality. Witnessed consummations became honeymoons. Bishops' brothels became criminalized industries. Female satisfaction was denied, then rediscovered. Contraception evolved from lethal potions to safe science. Grave dust love potions gave way to dating apps. Rope leashes became hashtags. Yet beneath the grotesque detail, the constants remain. The hunger for pleasure, the ache for connection, the fear of pregnancy, the urge to punish betrayal. These threads stretch across centuries. We've changed the methods, but not the instincts. Medievals weren't alien. They were us, stripped of privacy, forced to live their most intimate struggles on the public stage. That is what chills most. Not their strangeness, but their familiarity. We still wrestle with the same needs, only now in secret, or digitally broadcast by choice. Where medievals endured community surveillance, we invite algorithmic surveillance, sharing our desires in apps and feeds. Perhaps we've circled back, trading ropes and whips for data trails and ghosting. So next time you complain about dating awkwardness, remember, the alternative once involved grave robbing for love spells. Next time you curse contraception side effects, be thankful you're not drinking lead. Next time you feel performance anxiety, at least no clerk is documenting it in a courtroom ledger. And if your wedding feels stressful, at least your cousins aren't in the bedroom with you. The liberties we shrug off today would have been miracles to them. Privacy in bed, medical confidentiality, contraception that doesn't kill, the freedom to love for desire, not desperation. Freedoms wrested out of centuries of nightmare. History strips away our illusions. People have always lusted, loved, cheated, panicked, and punished. The only difference is how public the consequences were. Their world made sex a spectacle. Ours hides it in secrecy, or splashes it on screens. Different costumes, same play. So subscribe if you want more disturbing truths your teachers never dared to mention. Comment the part that shocked you most. Was it the courtroom examinations, the bishop's brothel empires, or the rope leashes? And remember, whatever drama your love life brings, at least you're not being paraded naked through the streets while your neighbors throw dung. History. It doesn't just give perspective, it makes you appreciate the present.